The ideas and information explored in this webinar are featured in Dewey Rossetti's book, Parenting Bright Kids Who Struggle in School, a strength-based approach to helping your child thrive and succeed. Available from proofrock.com, Amazon, Barnes& Noble, or your favorite local bookseller. So the author of this book is just a wonderfully talented author. She has been retired from a very successful career in business, and moved into, really because of some personal story of her own, she moved into a focus on supporting parents who have kids who are learn differently. She is the co-founder of the Parents Education Network, which eventually was acquired by the Children's Health Council, but all that good information, that good networking is still available at the Children's Health Council. She is a founding director and emeritus chair of Populous, which is an organization that focuses on the science of individuality and how that can be actualized in our culture to help people come to their full potential. Let me introduce to you guys a wonderful author, Dewey Rossetti. Welcome to Dewey.
Thank you, Joel, and thank you, Stephanie, and thank you to all of the participants today. And welcome, and thank you for having me. I'm very excited about starting to talk about my book.
Well, wonderful, wonderful. Perhaps give us a little bit of background, because you've got a personal experience that brought you to this topic. So maybe talk a little bit about that personal experience, and then how that motivated you to write this book.
Okay, so most parents who know something about the field, it, I was brought into it by my wonderful daughter who is going to be 30 this year. So my experience is 25 years ago, started 25 years ago, and really hasn't ended. These things don't change, learning differences and different ways of thinking. Thank God they don't change. So we have all of these different neurodiverse people in our culture. But I started when my little girl came home from kindergarten, and she was 6. And she came home the second week, Tuesday. I mean, I really never forget it. Tuesday of the second week of kindergarten, and I thought I was home free. I was going to go back to work, and everything was going to be very different for me. I was going to go back. Was working at Levi Strauss, and I could get my job back, and so forth. And she came in and melted down, which was totally not like her. And she said, "I can't sound it out." All the girls, a girls' private school, which is a hard contrast for a kid who's dyslexic. And that's what it proved to be. All the girls can sound it out. I can't. And of course, I told her that it would change and she would learn how, and you don't know right away. But she was right. And if I were to have that experience today, with all I have studied and I know, and so many different stories from other parents, I would have not sent her the next day because it was so clear the way she said it, and she's still that clear today. Uh, she couldn't sound it out because she's dyslexic. But it took me, and this is the part that I have the mea culpa about. It's very hard for me to remember the pain we went through because it took 4 years of her going to that school every day and not learning how to read. It took 4 years for us to get to the point of using the D word. 25 years ago, they didn't so much here in our area. And so fast forward to the pain part, which I do write about so that people understand the social emotional fallout, which for these kids when they're waiting to see if they're going to learn something. It's a terrible approach. But we finally found the right school for her, which is a school for kids who are dyslexic. And that was where I learned so much that changed my whole, I mean, it just changed the way I thought about everything to see all these very successful kids who really didn't start out school the way we all did and the way we all remember it being and think it should be. So it opened my eyes. It also did, that school was a wonderful place for her and for me. We both thrived. And at that school, then I was able to recruit some parents because we were also grateful to be there and to learn so much every day about dyslexia and ADHD and other kinds of different ways of thinking, that we started a group after we said, what would life be after Charles Armstrong? Because we know this isn't, the struggles aren't going to stop in high school. And it went to the eighth grade. My daughter was there for 5 years. And so we started, when she was in the seventh grade, actually, we started Parents Education Network, and a long way around of saying this is really the reason why I wrote the book, because the experience we had, and I think all of us on that original board for sure would agree, it was life changing for us. We had all kind of seen our kids come to grips with who they were, and they could all self advocate, and we had done it individually, so we formed a group to help other parents learn how to do that. And the positive experience of the 10 years at Penn, and it wasn't just our daughters or sons who thrived as a result of what we learned through all the speakers we had and all the conversations we had, and so forth, and all the interaction between the peer groups in that organization. We became just so positive about neurodiversity, and it really caught. I mean, you couldn't. It was contagious, and you would see these success stories every day. And then we would stand up in front of the kids, and they would stand up in front of us and tell us how they were handling it, and then they went out on panels. So it was an atmosphere that I wish everybody who has a kid who's a different thinker could enjoy. And I thought if I could just make it come alive in the book, perhaps we can get parents back, because we had a very grassroots effort, and you can't get to everyone that way. So I was hoping the book would bring that back alive again.
That makes a lot of sense. I think in reading the book, one of the things that is it's so powerful is that kids who struggle in school, often there is can can be a sense of almost victimhood of the system
Oh yeah.
is holding you down. And I think that the message in your book is that kids and their parents can have agency, and that there is an opportunity here for taking control over your pathways. And that leads me into sort of a lot of the thinking in this book is influenced by Todd Rose, who is a professor at Harvard. He has come up. His labeling is the science of the individual. And what Todd talks about in his work, and you deal brilliantly with this in your book, is that there's sort of three principles behind this idea of the science of individuality and the individual. One is this jagged profile, and I'm going to ask you about that in a second. The other is that we perform differently in different contexts, and we need to take control over the context where we can perform and avoid the ones where we don't. And then we all have these different pathways to reaching what is our actualized self, or our what we have agency to achieve. And so those are three sort of important principles, but it all starts with this idea of the jagged profile. Could you talk a little bit about that profile and what that is, and what it means?
Well, that I'm so glad you brought that up, because I think that was the main reason I wrote the book. I mean, main thing I wanted to point out to people is this new thinking that that is such a contrast to the comparison thinking that we have now in a lot of classrooms. How did you rank in the class, which has nothing to do with your individual growth? And Todd has just turned that all on its head, and taken the idea of an average kid out of the conversation. So I just, Joel, am going to hold this book up. If you could see it, this is Todd's book that explains it. If anyone wants to go a little further, I'm going to do a very brief dip into it. But this is my Bible, actually, and it's called The End of Average. It's a very empowering book, which I think this concept is. So if you could put up the thing, I'll just say one sentence about the jagged profile offers a different way to look at your child. And it is a visual that you can draw, actually. And I drew one for the book, but I want to show you what the first one that I saw was Todd's idea. And what it does, instead of saying that these two kids, I don't see the IQ up there, but these two girls both have an IQ of 100 and something. Their average, if
It's
you will.
it's it's 103, Dewey. It's on
Oh,
those
it's
little posters.
okay, 103. Okay. So that, people go run with that and they say, oh, that's an average IQ. That's an average kid. She can't do this. We need a big high IQ to do this. And I have a lot of relatives who talk like that. And it just drives me crazy now that I understand the concept. If you look at this, you will get very clearly in your head how people differ in the various parts of their brains in terms of what they use to attack a problem or to figure something out. And the fact that they have the same IQ is irrelevant, right? Because if you're looking for someone who's very good at math, for example, you might do this person who's really good at symbol searching. Or these are breakdowns from the psychological language in the PsychEv report that I think most people are familiar with. So this is just a little brief notion of how different people are, even though they have this label that makes them look like they're the same. And I think it just tells volumes about what all there is to know about your child. And I in the book, I also made one for Melissa's things that were outside of school because Melissa did not particularly go high on these things because they're language based, a lot of them, or the testing is language based, and she's dyslexic.
And
So
Melissa is your daughter?
Melissa is, I'm sorry, is my daughter's name in the book. Yes. And she's the one who's going to turn 30. So there's mine, which is not nearly as professional. And I expect parents or teachers to not be. But what I love about this way of looking at a person's talents and challenges is that it is not judgmental, right? You just look at it and see what you can see very easily. If you have a kid who's very good at visual spatial, well, Melissa is an incredible artist, and a lot of kids with dyslexia are. I wouldn't want to say they all are, but she is. And she's also a very good athlete, and she has a very good spatial sense on a field, for example. And that's the way you can start to analyze. And I think it's so interesting for kids to see this about themselves. They get very interested, and then they take ownership and say, well, if I'm good with this, and I'm not good with that, I'm going to go seek out things that I can do with this particular strength. So I think it's a hugely valuable tool, and it gives you a very different, for parents especially, but for teachers too. I mean, you can do this on a notepad when you're trying to analyze a kid and how you would approach them. Obviously, you approach their strengths if you can.
Perfect. That's really informative, and I'm thinking uh, one of the sort of the principles that we work with here is that human ability is on a spectrum. All of these different talents are on a spectrum, and you would say in the book, you mentioned that there's some folks that speculate that 20% of people have learning differences. And honestly, I would think that everyone has learning differences. It's just that it sort of shows up as something that is a hindrance in school, maybe in 20%. But we all have that jagged profile, all of us, and we struggle. So I'll have a.
Well,
We
that's
were.
part.
Go
Go
ahead.
ahead. That's part of what this book is about, the end of average, that every single person, even those straight A 4.3 grade point average kids who were the good athletes and the musicians and seem to have it all, they have a jagged profile. Every individual does, and it's as different and individualized as a fingerprint. So that's why labels like ADHD and dyslexia are very misleading. And that's one of my messages in the book is yes, it's a really good thing to be able to get started with your child about where do you start to see where some breakdowns are in terms of their showing their talents. And those are the challenges, right? And some have a very wide gap in their jagged profile, but so do a lot of very famous people have the same gap. And I actually didn't know that. I really didn't know that. I had what would be called a fixed mindset when I came to this, and a lot of parents do. You'd be amazed at your own mindset about this thing. Now, other things, mindset changes from topic to topic. But in my case, I grew up with an idea that there really was a way to be smart, and there was a smart that you were born with, and you lived with it, and you know, basically it was your destiny how smart you were. And one sister was smarter than I was, and the other sister was more creative. You do these comparisons, and it's so dangerous and limiting. That when I became so aware of that through Todd and all of his individualized thinking, I just keep thinking to myself, if parents understood this, they would, if they understood how individualized it is and how their kids are being victimized in school with a very narrow definition of something that they shouldn't even try to achieve, they would be so much better off and they would be so much more comfortable in school. I can't stand to see these kids suffer while we figure out as adults what to do with them, which
Right.
is kind of
Yeah.
my story, that my child stayed 4 years in a school where she couldn't be.
That absolutely, absolutely. Can you talk a little? I want to go back to the mindsets piece because that sense of how does the growth mindset piece influence parenting, and then how does that influence children is really important. I want to circle back to it, but I do want to say, okay, now once we have the jagged profile and we know our child's specific strengths and our child's specific weaknesses, how does that inform the way we're going to educate them or lead them through their learning experiences? How is that strength-based approach versus a deficit-based model? How does that work for you as a someone who's worked with kids like this?
Well, for one thing, it helps you with yourself. If you're honest with yourself, and I have some reflection pages in the book. So, parenting, as you know, is the hardest thing we have to do. And if you start with yourself and say, where are my strong suits? And I'm actually boldly, I wish I weren't so honest about where my shortcomings were as I was bringing up Melissa, but we all have them. And I was very impatient with her and so forth. And she is a kid who is now very anxious because I think of my approach in the beginning. And I think the jagged profile comes in where you give yourself some empowerment over who this child is instead of just being confused. Why are you so nervous all the time? If you can see really in front of you in black and white in a jagged profile kind of way, what their strengths are and how they're being challenged all day. This kid, not to go on and on because it's all in the book, but my Melissa is an athlete that's probably in the top 0.5% of the country. She's a very, very strong athlete, went on a scholarship, for rowing and so forth. And therefore, the things that go with that, she's very competitive. And why didn't I understand that a very competitive kid is going to notice the second day of school that she's not keeping up with the other 40 girls, right? And how important is that? So, had I understood the things that go, the complexity of what we were dealing with, she fell apart because of the competition. Because she was going to go, she was king of the mountain in preschool because preschool concentrates on motor skills, and she had them. She had them. She was, the best at the playground and the strongest and the most stamina. And then I put her in a situation with these girls, the worst situation, really, some would say, some educators would say, because she was in a girls' private school. The kids were reading Harry Potter in the first grade, and she's competitive. So, that's the way I think it empowers you. I started to get so much more of a vision of and more empathy with her. Oh my God, what position? Why in the world did I put her in a girls' school when she's, got all this physical energy and would be much more comfortable with a mixed class, for example? So those are the kinds of things you learn, but you don't get that from the school because, and it's not the school's fault. I'm not blaming anyone. I'm saying this is a one size fits all education system. And this Todd's thinking gives us a way of differentiating who our kids are in this. Who is this individual and what would be best for them? And
Yeah.
really helped me when I understood that. It really helped me to find the right school for her.
Yeah, the great example in Dr. Rose's book was that this I didn't prepare to give this example, so I'm going to get it wrong a little bit. But he had one of the early researchers in brain scan technology had come up with they took brain scans of 40 different people, and then they came up with an average brain. What
Oh
when
God,
this
yeah,
yeah,
yes,
when this kind of question gets fired, this brain lights up, this part of the brain. Well, anyway,
yeah.
when they averaged it all together, what the researcher looked back at this composite brain they had, the average brain, and it didn't look like a single one of the actual subjects in the study because it meant nothing. It was just an average of everything, and that was I think that's to your point about the jagged profile is 103 means nothing until you really kind of go through and parse out what are the specifics. I thought it was just
Also doesn't. I'm sorry, Joel. I get too excited about this topic, but because I think Todd's research has given parents an enormous tool, and there is no other place where they can read about it where it is actually written for parents, because and it's not as though his book is over the head of people. He does a wonderful job of explaining it, but I think the relevance comes through a little better in my book because it meant so much to me to meet him. And I met him through Penn when we had him as a speaker, and then my husband and I just realized, I mean, he can change your thinking in a 20-minute talk, and he has. Yeah,
yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
that way, and most important, the way not just to change it for nothing, but to change the way you look at people and your kids.
Yeah, I thought the way I was sort of conceptualizing this was the end of average, that the book that he wrote was sort of the layperson's introduction to this topic. Your book is this is for parents. This is how this particular philosophy and science applies to parenting and education. And I think you did a brilliant job with that. Can you let me circle back to something I said I was going to circle back to earlier. You felt like that early on you had this fixed mindset about what is
Yes.
smart and what is performance, and that is something that you had to change personally. Can you talk a little bit about that and how that influences other parents?
Well, Carol Dweck uh, uh, came out with a book called Mindset. I think it was just called Mindset in the beginning. And she's got some new editions of it. So I don't know if she's changed the title, but she's from right down here at Stanford. We tried to have her as a speaker because a few times, and she's so busy uh, that we couldn't at Penn. But I think she really broke open a lot of thinking before Todd's breakthrough book about how to look at individuals. She actually looked at this idea that you can limit motivation, and parents would die if they understood this, and that's why her book was such a breakthrough book for teachers and parents. If you have a fixed mindset, uh, my child's dyslexic, they're not going to be able to ever be a writer, for example. How could you be a writer if you're dyslexic? Well, we know that there are tons of writers. How could you be an actor and memorize lines and even read a script? Tons in that industry alone. There's a huge percentage, uh, and so forth. And that is a fixed mindset that you have in your mind, that there's a limitation, and that trying, no matter how hard you try, you're limited by how you're born and how you're wired. And so it's I think it's kind of the first step to examine if you might have that mindset. And in my case, I really do honestly say that it took me several years to figure that out. That I was looking at my daughter with a negative, I call it a negative mindset, but a fixed mindset. Oh my God, how are we going to help her? When in fact, my husband didn't have that prejudice that I had. He had been in the Air Force. He had trained a whole bunch of people, and we just had very different experiences. And so you just start to see that you have, and I didn't know I thought that. I didn't know that I had limited my idea of what smart was to these specific things. And parents won't. They'll have to start and really reflect and say, am I actually privately limiting what my child can do because they're not in the top, 90% of their class? And it's so freeing to know, and it really helps you with your growth mindset to know that that 90% ranking in a class of 30 kids is kind of irrelevant to your child becoming the best version of himself. So I think it's just mind-boggling to look at a graph like I just showed you that Todd introduced, and use these tools to see how your child can change, and it will make them feel so much more in control to say, here are the tools you have, which are the strengths. Here are the tools you have to work around this difference or this challenge.
Because and really because in the book you keep talking about how influential the parent is and these experiences that the kids have in formulating a kid's, I would say, you use the word self-esteem, but I would also say self-concept.
Oh
How
yeah,
do I see myself in this larger context, you know?
absolutely. And self-concept is a word I actually, had I remembered that word, I might have used it. But self-esteem, honestly, but self-esteem gets so, how it's in the schools all the time.
Mhm, mhm.
So, and one of the things I'd love to point out is that the reason I focused on I think everybody should focus on strengths with all parenting, right? I mean, you just learn something about that. It is best practices now. The reason it's so important for these kids who stand out as not being the same thinkers as the kids in the classroom is that it was started out as a deficit model, and it still is. And a learning difference, you actually subtract what the kid can do, the average. I mean, it's mind boggling that we actually use this, but, and there will be, I hope there will be a change to what a kid's IQ is, or what a kid's differences are, or different kinds of thinking, but you subtract a certain average of scores from another average of scores, which should be potential. And when you do that, what do you have? It doesn't it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And if you can get the child to understand that they can use these wonderful strengths they have, for example, a kid who might be a very strong conceptual thinker and not a very good coordinated person, for example, which would show up on some of these tests. Uh, that's a huge uh, bullying situation for some kids. And then they can never really show what they know because they're getting bullied for a weakness. So they have to use their strength to, I don't know, work around uh, how the bullies treat them, and to answer those bullying kinds of attacks, I should say, or attitudes. Attitudes.
Well, and that gets us to the part, and we're not going to be able to talk about it today, and because we don't have time, and obviously we can't go through the whole book, but the other items, those principles that you talk about, the context, uh,
Oh,
I
yes,
just,
right.
how important that is. Once you know your jagged profile and all that, then you look at, well, that's where the kid sort of takes some agency. It's what context, in what context do I perform? What context do I not perform? I was telling this story when we did the webinar on the behavior rating scales, where you literally are looking at discrete behaviors. It's one of the reasons that a behavior rating scale can pick up a kid with a strengths that you wouldn't have seen otherwise. um,
Yes,
but this kid had an IQ that was, I forget, I think it was 130. It was 99th percentile on his
right.
achievement records. And this teacher wrote in the comment, like, this is the laziest kid I've taught in 20
Yes,
years. Well, that's a
exactly.
context. That kid didn't perform in that context. So becoming an agent, knowing your context is very important. And then also knowing these pathways to reach an end that don't look like that. Uh, there is an easy path that the kid who makes straight A's and goes right to the next thing goes to the next thing, and they get their award at the end, and they've got it. Well, that's great, but then for a lot of these kids with these jagged profiles, the pathways are circuitous, and they go down paths and they come back around, but they get there, and in many cases they become the kind of prominent individuals that you're talking about. You do these marvelous profiles at the back of the book of prominent individuals and how their paths got them to where they are. So there's so much to this topic that I'm afraid we
I know.
can't.
I know. I mean, almost each chapter could be its own book. I mean, you could write a whole book about uh, Todd's concepts and how you would use them. And in fact, that's what he and I set out to do at first. And then I thought, oh no, there's just so many other things, especially the mindset part that has to change and
Mhm,
so forth.
mhm,
But one very quick example about
mhm.
context, because people say all the time, I'm not a math person. I'm not a math person. And my niece teaches math, and she was a math major. And she says to me, "Nobody says I'm not an English person. Why are you allowed to not be a math person? Everybody can be a math person if they're taught properly." And she's a wonderful teacher and tutor. And so she's preached that to me since long before I had all opinions and knew about the jagged profile. But math is broken up into a whole bunch of ways to analyze the different functions in math. So you might not be good at remembering how to add because you don't have a good to carry a number because you don't have a good working memory. That doesn't have to do with math skills. You might be really conceptually high, 98 percentile, and figuring out a math problem. But if your parents say you don't understand math, don't try to go into math, what a limitation. When in fact, conceptually, you'd be better than most. So that's the way you have to start using these concepts to, and helping your child understand. Because I don't think parents should choose any pathways. You let the kid choose the pathway, and they will find out if it's their right one, and they will figure out their workarounds. And so I just think that's really the message is you help them figure out context until they can do it themselves. They take charge, and when you don't get excited about the first. I have a kid in there in the case studies, who we all thought that he was going to be a pro athlete, and then we thought he was going to be a chef of a four-star restaurant, and now he's in a totally different intellectual philosophical place, and he's in college. So you have to who knows where he'll wind up, but he's very comfortable with who he is and his strengths and weaknesses.
Oh, absolutely. Well, and that is something that we talk about more than just this book, is that teaching kids to be advocates for themselves, because
No,
that they're
it's the whole thing, and that's what you're doing when you are figuring out the jagged profile. And the reason I said before, it's important to know your own is you really it will help you really to understand where yours don't match each other.
makes sense, perfect sense. Dewey, Rossetti, let me take a little moment to do some housekeeping for the audience, and uh, I will be back for the Q&A section of this presentation. Let me remind everybody that if you'll be prepared to take a screenshot, this is the book that we're talking about today. It's available from Amazon, Barnes and Noble, and your local booksellers as well, and proofrock.com. Let me show this. Uh, your contact information. Uh, your website is deweyrossetti.com, and let me show you. There's plenty of. If you'll take a screenshot of that, if you'd like to look up that URL, let me bring you guys over to Dewey's website. Um, there's lots of information and resources here at your website, a little bit of information about you, and I would encourage everybody to take a visit there as well. While we're coming back to the webinar, I would encourage anyone who has additional questions, please put them in the Q&A box, and then please upvote the questions that you think are really important, because Stephanie has a lot of questions in the box there, and so letting her know what's very important is great. So Stephanie, if you take over and run the Q&A piece, please.
Sure
Should I?
thing. Oh, I'll be asking you some of the questions here, Dewey. So it
Okay.
looks like we got a question about, like, practically how do you create a jagged profile? Is there a template of questions? Are there categories that you can look at if you're trying to do this yourself as a teacher? Where should you start?
And so, thank you. So that there is a chapter in the book about it, actually, about how to create the jagged profile, and you can do it on any kind of a scale, on any kind of a topic or scale. If you want to do on the things that are needed in athletics, for example, which would be, a very strong. There's is that
Yes,
cat or
yes.
dog?
Sorry about that.
I
Sorry,
should
I got
I sh-
distracted. I got distracted.
no, I should have mentioned that we're definitely
We are at home.
we are at home. We closed the office
I
back
know.
in early March, and so we're
I'm sorry. I probably shouldn't have called. I should have distracted. So ask me that question again. Oh, how do you create it? So The topics you would need help, I think, if you were to do the use the psych ed report, which is most parents are asked to get their child tested if they're struggling in school, and I took a whole section in the index to explain and try to break down that report as best I could, because I don't think it's anywhere for parents to understand. And it costs now $3,000 to $5,000 to do one of those reports, and you're expected to do them every 3 years for different kinds of qualifications for uh, accommodations. So there are categories there. If you don't understand those, and that's what I used for Melissa. I said, math is a category, and I broke it out into she could do the conceptual math really well. She could get to the answer by approximating in her head. She could not, for example, do the math facts because she doesn't have a very strong working memory. So that is what I did, and that's what I think teachers should do. And you might need to ask a psychologist or the tester to help you with the categories in order to make your own template.
Yeah, that makes sense. Um, Another question here. As a teacher, are there things to look for that signal dyslexia? This person believes they have two students who might have it. So what are some signs in the classroom?
Well,
Sorry about that.
that on my no problem. I have that. I think you see you got rescued back there by somebody. I have that on my website. I have that on my website, which is signs and signals, I call it, and it's not just narrowly for dyslexia. It is for this different kind of wiring that is different from the other 80%, and really it is accepted that at least 20% of the students in your classroom are going to think differently. But depending on the population and how that class came together, it could be a much higher number, and in some it's 40 or 50% who are very different types of thinkers. And wait, what was your question? I'm halfway through this answer, and
Oh.
I'm trying to close it out, and I'm just saying, what was your question?
What are things to look for that signal
Oh, okay.
dyslexia?
So dyslexia often is accompanied by ADHD, which is important to know too. So if you're seeing distraction, that doesn't necessarily go with dyslexia. Dyslexia is a language-based thing. Here's a big key, and it's one that nobody can believe until they see it with their own eyes, which is a child is reading and they come to a word like the. You tell them what that word is, and it could be there in the next, 2 words. It can be the again, and they won't recognize it. That is a huge signal. Other signals are mispronunciations of words or misuse of words. Not hearing, not being able to tell the story in their own words after they've read it, not being able to read aloud is a big sign, and fear of reading aloud is a big sign. And there are so many signs and signals that motor skills can even help tell you. If you can't tie your shoes properly, or if it's hard to tell time. For example, we had a speaker who stood up and said all of his brothers were doctors and lawyers, and he started a company that it's now a multi-billion-dollar company. So, oh, poor thing. But when he started, I mean, he's the baby, and he's now done the best. But he said, my dad knew in 10 minutes because he always would take the next child in to tell time. And he said, after 2 weeks, he said he'd do it in an afternoon with my brothers. And after 2 weeks, he said, my father said, something's not right here. This is not working. So once you get attuned to watching your child's individuality, you will see some things. And for a teacher, there are all kinds of checklists. The understood.org, for example, is a place you can look right up and find out what teachers should be looking for, or how they should be analyzing some behavior in their classrooms. It's very hard to understand as a parent and a teacher, the kids aren't doing these things on purpose. Like when my daughter Melissa didn't recognize the second time around, I'm thinking, oh, come on, you're just not, and you say you're not trying, you're not thinking, you're not focused. Um, that's not it. And it just changes your whole attitude when you understand that.
Stephanie, maybe time for one more question if
Sure. We have someone who teach both bilingual and 2E students. As I work with a diverse low SES high needs district, gathering the stakeholders together to recognize a jagged profile is a challenge. Do you have any recommendations?
I would have to understand what the challenge is. Is it,
Getting the stakeholders together. If your school is
I would
low
make
SES, high
I would
needs.
make the stakeholders read that book. End of end. I would.
Mhm.
I mean, make is too strong, isn't it? I'm not in education anymore, so that's not a word you're supposed to use. But what I would suggest is that everybody should start with this, or start with mine, which is really written for that purpose to give you a toe in the water with this thinking. And you won't think the same way. I'm telling you. I mean, I don't know if my book is that profound, but this one is. It really gives you the notion that you have to change your thinking in order to understand these kids. The stakeholder. I worked in schools for a long time. I started out as a teacher, and all through Penn, we worked with all the faculties and the administrators. I understand about the term stakeholders, but I think that anybody in education who has not read this book is going to be a hard sell, uh, or my book, which which is a little self-promoting, but I can't help it. It's just a new way of thinking, and it needs to be routinized. More people have to do it. Period.
yeah, I think in the field of gifted education, there has been this evolution over time. You think about there were states that used just that IQ as a way of identifying
Oh my
for
gosh!
giftedness, and
Still,
then we've progressively moved into much more complex profiles of looking for potential talent, and we've looked at, and we talk about kids that have specific subject area aptitude because they don't necessarily exhibit those in other areas, and we're basically coming around to the idea of the jagged profile, even as a field. So what you're advocating for is something that I believe this field is moving in that direction as
oh, I think
well.
they absolutely are. And all these different ways of educating now, and different kinds of schools that are cropping up, and the rise in homeschooling. I mean, people are starting to realize that the one size fits all doesn't help most individual kids to develop their own strengths.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, I'm so disappointed that we're out of time. I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. I didn't want to steal the thing, but as we've talked about, I was labeled with dyslexia
Yes,
early
yes.
on. In fact, I'll tell you that I read Todd's book through audiobook because it was
Oh
a
yeah.
lot.
Yeah. That's
uh, but when you mentioned the reading out loud in school, oh my gosh, because I wore glasses when I was in school, and I would be so embarrassed that my face would start to get hot, and I would start to like steam, would like
so
steam up
stream
my
up your
glasses.
glasses.
I
Oh my
couldn't
God.
read.
Oh, it is. And Jonathan Mooney, I don't know if you know Jonathan Mooney, who's another one who's a wonderful, he has kind of an evangelistic way of speaking, but he talks about that and how he got to know Shirley in the office, and Ben, the janitor, because he kept leaving the classroom when it was his turn to read because he would go into a panic. And
Absolutely.
even today, at 42 years old, if you get an email from John, you have to decipher it because he just doesn't worry about the spelling with his friends.
That's very funny. That's very funny. Well, let me thank everyone first of all who attended today. Again, I know we're in some stressful times, and I'm so appreciative that you guys took a little slice of your day and came and visited with us. Stephanie McCauley, my editor here in Austin, Texas. Thank you, Stephanie. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks so much. This is great.
And Dewey Rossetti, it's just been a wonderful 50 minutes of our time, and I so appreciate you being here. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much, both of you.
Bye bye, everybody.
Bye.
I